In the dense forests of southwestern Vermont, where the Green Mountains rise like ancient sentinels against the sky, there exists a place that has consumed lives without explanation. Not with the violence of nature, not with the certainty of accident, but with something far more unsettling: complete and utter disappearance. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 people walked into these woods and simply ceased to exist. They left behind families, questions, and a legacy of dread that would transform this quiet corner of New England into one of America's most disturbing mysteries. This is not a story of monsters in the traditional sense, though monsters have been blamed. This is not a tale of curses, though curses have been invoked. This is the documented history of human beings who stepped into the wilderness and vanished so thoroughly that decades of searching, investigating, and theorizing have produced almost nothing. No answers, no closure, just an expanding void where 5 lives used to be. Welcome to the Bennington Triangle. The geography of disappearance. The Bennington Triangle is not an official designation. You will not find it on any map published by the United States Geological Survey. The name itself was coined in 1992 by Vermont author and folklorist Joseph Citro during a public radio broadcast, intentionally echoing the infamous Bermuda Triangle to describe a loosely defined area in southwestern Vermont where an unusual concentration of disappearances occurred. The term captured the public imagination immediately, and within years, the Bennington Triangle had become synonymous with unexplained vanishings and paranormal phenomena. The boundaries of this triangle remain deliberately vague, but the heart of the mystery centers unmistakably on Glastenbury Mountain. Rising to an elevation of 3,648 feet, Glastenbury Mountain sits within what is now the Green Mountain National Forest, a vast expanse of protected wilderness covering approximately 400,000 acres across Vermont. The mountain and its surrounding wilderness encompass parts of several townships: Bennington, Woodford, Shaftesbury, and the ghost towns of Glastenbury and Somerset. The landscape here is unforgiving. Dense forests of northern hardwoods and evergreens blanket the steep slopes, creating a canopy so thick that even on bright days, the forest floor exists in perpetual twilight. The terrain is riddled with ravines, hidden streams, abandoned mine shafts from long-dead industries, and natural sinkholes formed by the region's limestone geology. The mountains create their own weather patterns, with winds that can change direction suddenly and completely, disorienting even experienced outdoorsmen. Fog rolls in without warning, transforming familiar trails into alien landscapes within minutes. For those who know these woods, the density and difficulty of the terrain offers a rational explanation for why people might become lost. But it does not explain why they are never found. It does not explain why extensive searches involving hundreds of volunteers, military personnel, aircraft, and bloodhounds produce nothing. Not bodies, not clothing, not even the smallest trace that a human being ever walked that particular patch of earth. The towns that time. Forgot to understand the Bennington Triangle, you must first understand the towns that sit at its heart, particularly Glastenbury. This mountain community has its own tragic history that predates the disappearances, a history that reads like a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding over more than a century. Glastenbury was chartered in 1761 by New Hampshire Governor Benning Wentworth, part of the land grant frenzy that preceded Vermont's admission to the Union. But the charter meant nothing to the first families who attempted to settle there. The mountainous terrain made farming nearly impossible. The short growing season meant even successful harvests could barely sustain a family through Vermont's brutal winters. The rocky soil yielded little beyond frustration. According to Vermont's first census in 1791, only 6 families inhabited Glastenbury. By 1800, Those 6 families had been replaced by 8 entirely different ones. Of those 8, only 3 remained in 1810, and only one of those would persist into later decades. This pattern of settlement, abandonment, and resettlement would define Glastonbury's entire existence. Despite the hardships, newcomers continued to arrive in small numbers throughout the early 19th century. By 1810, the population had grown to 76. But the years that followed brought economic depression across Vermont, and by 1840, only 53 people remained in Glastenbury, scratching out existences in a place that seemed determined to remain uninhabited. Everything changed after the Civil War. Business interests in nearby Bennington recognized that while Glastenbury might be worthless for agriculture, it possessed something incredibly valuable: vast forests of mature timber. By 1872, construction began on what would be an engineering marvel, a railroad climbing up the mountain along Ball's Brook, gaining as much as 250 feet of elevation per mile in some sections. It was an improbable achievement that briefly transformed Glastenbury into a boom town. The line terminated where the brook forked, and there the settlement of South Glastenbury grew rapidly. Another settlement, Fayville, developed to the north. Sawmills appeared. Charcoal production facilities followed. By 1880, Glastenbury's population peaked at 241 people, with many more transient workers cycling through the logging camps. The town now had a school, a post office, boarding houses, a general store, and all the infrastructure of a functioning community. But the boom was built on a finite resource. By the late 1880s, the mountain had been stripped nearly bare of mature timber. The charcoal industry, which had seemed like Glastenbury's economic future, was already becoming obsolete as oil replaced charcoal as the nation's primary fuel source. In 1889, the railroad stopped operating. The sawmills closed. The workers left. In 1894, there was one last desperate attempt to save Glastenbury. The railroad was revived as an electric trolley line, and businessmen poured money into converting South Glastenbury into a tourist resort. A casino was built. The hotel was renovated. For one glorious summer in 1898, visitors came to escape the heat and enjoy the mountain air. Then, that winter, a devastating flood destroyed the railroad tracks running along Ball's Brook. The resort was abandoned mid-season, its buildings left to decay where they stood. Glastenbury's population dwindled rapidly. By 1920, fewer than 20 people remained. By 1937, the Vermont State Legislature made it official, voting to unincorporate the town. Glastenbury ceased to exist as a legal municipality. A supervisor appointed by the state would handle any administrative matters, but for all practical purposes, Glastenbury became a ghost town, with most of its territory eventually absorbed into the Green Mountain National Forest. Somerset, Glastenbury's neighboring township, followed an almost identical trajectory. Thriving briefly during the logging boom with a population exceeding 300, it too was unincorporated in 1937, its residents gone, its buildings abandoned to the forest. By the time the disappearances began in 1945, these ghost towns existed only as ruins scattered through the wilderness. Stone foundations where sawmills once stood, a decrepit footbridge spanning Ball's Brook, the rusted remains of the trolley tracks slowly being swallowed by vegetation. Places where people had lived and worked and built futures now returned to the mountain that had never wanted them there in the first place. The curse of the four winds. Long before European settlers arrived, before any town was chartered or any tree was felled, the indigenous peoples of the region looked at Glastenbury Mountain and sensed something wrong. The Abenaki people, part of the larger Algonquian nation, used the surrounding lowlands for hunting and seasonal camps, but regarded the mountain itself with deep suspicion. According to folklore passed down and recorded by later researchers, The Abenaki called Glastenbury Mountain, the place where the four winds meet. The tradition holds that they believed powerful crosswinds converged at the mountain's peak, creating a nexus of unstable, unpredictable forces. Modern meteorologists would later confirm that the mountain's geography does create unusual wind patterns, with air currents flowing up from multiple valleys and meeting at elevation, producing sudden changes in direction and intensity that can disorient travelers. But according to the oral traditions that survived, the Abenaki saw more than just dangerous weather. They believed the mountain was cursed, a place where the natural and supernatural worlds intersected in dangerous ways. Based on what researchers have documented, they used the lower slopes as burial grounds, considering the mountain a boundary between the land of the living and the realm of spirits. But they reportedly did not venture to the higher elevations, did not hunt in the deepest forests, did not stay after dark. One particular legend spoke of an enchanted stone somewhere in the mountains, a massive boulder that appeared ordinary but possessed malevolent power. According to the tale as it has been recorded, this man-eating rock could sense when a human being stepped upon it, and at that moment it would open like a mouth, swallowing the person whole before closing again, leaving no trace. The victim would simply vanish, consumed by the mountain itself. Whether this legend represents a literal belief or a metaphorical warning about the mountain's dangers remains a matter of interpretation. The Abenaki also told stories of large, hairy creatures that inhabited the deep woods, beings that were neither fully animal nor fully human. These creatures were described as aggressive, dangerous, and territorial. Later settlers would hear similar accounts and dismiss them as superstition. But as the disappearances mounted, some would remember these old warnings and wonder if there might have been something to them beyond mere folklore. When European colonists began arriving in the 1700s, they brought their own supernatural framework, but quickly found reasons to fear Glastenbury. Early accounts describe strange lights visible from the mountain's peak, lights that would appear at night with no apparent source, moving through the forest or hovering in clearings. Settlers reported hearing unexplained sounds, crashes and screams and voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They spoke of odd smells that would suddenly appear in the woods, chemical or rotting odors that had no visible source. In the early 1800s, one of the first documented encounters with what would later be called the Bennington Monster occurred. A stagecoach traveling near Glastenbury Mountain was forced to stop when the road ahead had been washed out by a storm. When the driver climbed down to assess the damage, he noticed enormous footprints in the mud, far too large to be human. Before he could investigate further, the coach was suddenly attacked by a massive creature that emerged from the forest. The thing was powerful enough to knock the entire stagecoach onto its side. Passengers later reported seeing only a pair of eyes before the creature roared and retreated into the woods. The shaken travelers were eventually rescued, but the incident became part of local lore, one of many unexplained encounters in the mountains. In 1879, the New York Times reported on another incident. Two hunters were tracking game in the heavily wooded area north of Pownell when they encountered what they described as a wild man. The creature, covered in red hair with wild eyes, startled the hunters by jumping down from a rocky outcropping. One of the hunters managed to shoot and wound the creature, which let out a scream of pain and then charged directly at them. Both men dropped their weapons and fled, never returning to retrieve their gear. These accounts established Glastenbury Mountain's reputation as a place of strangeness long before the modern disappearances. The mountain was dangerous, yes, but it was dangerous in ways that transcended the normal hazards of wilderness. Something about the place felt wrong. The silence of the deep woods was too complete. The way fog could roll in and disorient travelers felt almost intentional. The sensation that something was watching from just beyond the tree line never quite went away. The first disappearance, Middie Rivers. On November 12, 1945, the first of the Triangle's modern victims vanished. His name was Middie Rivers, and nothing about his disappearance made sense. Rivers was 74 years old, but do not let that age fool you into thinking he was frail or confused. By all accounts, he was in excellent physical condition, having recently undergone a complete physical examination that confirmed his health. More importantly, Rivers was an experienced outdoorsman, a skilled hunter and fishing guide who had spent his entire life in the Bennington area. The mountains around Glastenbury were his territory. He knew every trail, every landmark, every likely place where game might be found. Friends and family described him as thoroughly familiar with the region, the kind of man who could navigate the woods in darkness if necessary. On that November day, the weather was unseasonably mild for Vermont, almost warm. Thanksgiving was only 2 weeks away, but there was no hint of the snow that would normally have arrived by then. Rivers was leading a group of 4 hunters, including his son-in-law, on what should have been a routine expedition in the area around Bickford Hollow, approximately 4 miles west of Bennington, near Vermont Route 9. The hunting party had been out since morning, working their way through the woods. As the group was heading back toward their camp for lunch sometime in the afternoon, Rivers told the others he was going to push ahead. He knew a shortcut and wanted to get the fire started before the rest arrived. The other hunters watched him walk away, moving through terrain he had crossed hundreds of times before. Rivers never made it to camp. When the other hunters arrived and found no sign of him, they initially were not concerned. Rivers was the most capable among them. Perhaps he had spotted game and gone after it. Perhaps he had decided to scout another area. They waited, prepared food, and expected to see him at any moment. By evening, concern had turned to alarm. The hunters began calling out, firing their rifles into the air to signal their location, standard practice for helping lost or injured companions find their way back. They heard nothing in response. As darkness fell completely, they made the difficult decision to hike out and alert authorities. The search that followed was extensive and thorough. Within days, more than 300 volunteers had joined the effort, including local residents who knew the area well and U.S. Army soldiers dispatched from Fort Devens in Massachusetts. The Vermont State Guard was called in. Experienced trackers combed through the woods, moving in organized search patterns designed to cover every square foot of ground. For 8 days, the search continued. Volunteers checked abandoned mine shafts, peered into ravines, searched along stream banks, and in the thick brush where an injured man might have crawled to seek shelter. The Army soldiers brought discipline and systematic methodology to the search. Local hunters brought intimate knowledge of the terrain. They found almost nothing. The only piece of evidence discovered was a single unspent rifle cartridge found on the bank of a nearby stream. It appeared to be the same type that Rivers used, and searchers theorized it might have fallen from his belt when he bent down, perhaps to get a drink of water. But there was no sign of Rivers himself, no footprints leading away from that spot, no indication he had ever been there at all. There was no evidence of an animal attack. Bears were common in the area, but bear attacks leave unmistakable signs: torn clothing, blood, drag marks, scattered belongings. There was nothing. Bobcats and the occasional lynx inhabited the mountains, but these animals were not known to attack full-grown adult humans. Mountain lions had not been credibly sighted in Vermont for years. As the search stretched past a week, many locals clung to hope that Rivers, with his skills and knowledge, had simply been injured and was surviving in the woods, waiting to be found. Any day, someone expected, he would emerge from the forest with a story about a broken leg or temporary confusion. The search party leaders expressed confidence that Rivers would be located. After all, as one leader noted, numerous people had been lost in the region over the decades, but eventually they were all recovered, either alive or as remains. That confidence proved misplaced. On the 8th day of searching, as volunteers prepared for another sweep, the first snow of the season began to fall. Within hours, a blanket of white covered the mountains, obscuring any remaining traces that might have existed. The search was reluctantly called off. Middie Rivers was never seen again. His body was never found. In the decades since his disappearance, hikers and hunters have crossed and recrossed the same terrain thousands of times. The area has been logged, surveyed, and photographed from the air. Nothing has ever turned up to explain what happened to him in those few minutes after he walked away from his hunting party. The case that changed everything. Paula Jean Welden. If Middie Rivers' disappearance was mysterious, what happened to Paula Jean Welden a year later elevated the strangeness to a new level and captured national attention in ways that would shape how people viewed Glastenbury Mountain for generations to come. Paula Welden was 18 years old, a sophomore at Bennington College, when she vanished on December 1, 1946. She was 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed 123 pounds, and by all accounts was healthy, active, and comfortable in outdoor settings. She was the oldest of 4 daughters in a family from Stamford, Connecticut, and had been enjoying her freshman year at the prestigious women's college. Sunday, December 1st, was unseasonably warm for December in Vermont, with temperatures reaching 50 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon. Paula worked 2 shifts in the college dining hall that day, finishing in the early afternoon. She returned to her dormitory room and changed out of her work clothes into more casual attire: blue jeans, a red jacket, and light sneakers. She told her roommate she was going for a walk, mentioned that she had missed being able to go home for Thanksgiving to visit her family, and said she wanted to take a hike to clear her head. No one thought anything unusual about this plan. Paula was known to enjoy being outdoors, and the Long Trail, a famous hiking path that runs more than 270 miles along Vermont's Green Mountains from Massachusetts toward Canada, was easily accessible from campus. The weather was perfect for an afternoon walk. Based on what witnesses observed, she appeared to expect to return before evening, as she was not dressed for freezing temperatures or carrying camping gear. Paula left campus sometime between 2:30 and 3 p.m. The exact sequence of events that followed has been pieced together from multiple witness accounts, and this is where the story becomes particularly unsettling because it demonstrates just how thoroughly someone can vanish even when multiple people see them. Paula did not simply walk into the woods and disappear. She was seen by numerous people along her route, and those sightings form a timeline that makes her ultimate vanishing even more inexplicable. The first confirmed sighting was by a local man who gave her a ride from the college to a location on Route 9, about 2 miles west of where the Long Trail crossed the road. Paula thanked him and got out of the vehicle. Other witnesses reported seeing her walking along Route 9 heading toward the trail access point. Danny Fager, who operated a gas station near the college entrance, reported seeing her. Lewis Knapp, a local contractor, saw her walking along the road. A Bennington Banner employee gave her directions when she asked how far the trail extended. An elderly couple out for their own hike recalled seeing a young woman in a red jacket walking along the trail ahead of them. They had been about 100 yards behind her for a time, close enough to notice she was alone and walking at a steady pace, but not close enough to speak to her. The trail at that point winds through mixed forest before beginning to climb toward higher elevation. It is well marked and well used, particularly on pleasant weekend afternoons. The elderly couple watched Paula round a curve in the trail, and when they reached the same spot minutes later, she was gone. Not just out of sight, gone completely. The couple walked the trail for some distance, expecting to catch sight of the young woman ahead of them. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. When they finally turned back, they mentioned the encounter, but thought nothing more of it. A young woman had been walking faster than them and gotten ahead. Nothing unusual about that. Paula Welden failed to attend class Monday morning. Her roommate reported her missing, and within hours, a search was organized. Initially, administrators and police hoped she had simply decided to extend her walk, perhaps stay overnight with friends in one of the nearby towns. But as hours became days with no sign of Paula, the search expanded rapidly. Paula's father, W. Archibald Welden, arrived from Connecticut immediately to coordinate with authorities and participate in the search. Sheriff Clyde Peck led teams of local men into the woods, focusing on the areas between Glastenbury Mountain and Bald Mountain. Soldiers from Fort Devens were brought in to search the long trail and surrounding wilderness. The FBI joined the investigation. The governor of Vermont made the case a priority. State police from Connecticut arrived to assist their Vermont counterparts. More than 1,000 people eventually participated in the search efforts. Aircraft flew over the mountains, searching for any sign of a person or disturbance in the forest canopy. Dogs tracked her scent from the trail, but lost it at various points, suggesting she had left the marked path, but providing no clear direction of travel. Volunteers spread out in carefully coordinated search patterns, calling Paula's name, looking for any trace of her passage. They found nothing. No clothing. No footprints beyond what could be confirmed near the trail. No sign of injury or struggle. No indication she had ever been in the woods at all once she rounded that curve out of sight of the elderly couple. Paula's case attracted enormous media attention. More than 100 reporters from major East Coast newspapers descended on Bennington. Her photograph appeared in papers across the country. A reward of $5,000 was posted for information leading to her recovery, an enormous sum in 1946. Tips poured in from across the region, each one investigated, each one leading nowhere. One particularly intriguing tip came from Fall River, Massachusetts. A waitress named Aura Telletier contacted police with a remarkable story. She claimed that a few days after Paula's disappearance, a young woman matching Paula's description had come into the modern restaurant, accompanied by an older man, perhaps 25 years old. The man appeared drunk and angry. When he got up to pay the bill, the young woman asked Telletier how far away Bennington was. Telletier gave her directions to the nearest bus depot, which was about 200 miles away. The woman said she was out of money and seemed dazed or confused. Telletier was convinced after seeing photographs that the woman had been Paula Welden. Investigators followed up on this lead extensively, but could never confirm the sighting or identify the man who had allegedly been with her. The restaurant's location and timeline made it theoretically possible, but without additional evidence, it remained just another unconfirmed sighting in a case that would ultimately produce hundreds of them. In 1950, a Western Union messenger insisted he had delivered a package to a woman in New York City who signed her name as Paula Welden and matched her description. By this time, the reward had grown to $8,000. The investigation verified the messenger's story as much as possible, but the trail went cold. No one could locate the woman who had signed for the package, and it remained unclear whether she had used the name deliberately or if it was simply a coincidence. Archibald Welden, Paula's father, pursued every lead personally for years. He never gave up hope of finding his daughter alive, but when asked by reporters if he still believed she would be found, his responses became increasingly despondent. "We've investigated roughly 200 tips," he said during one interview, "and none have led anywhere." Paula Jean Welden was never found. Decades of searching and investigating produced exactly zero physical evidence to indicate what happened to her after she walked around that curve in the long trail. Her case remains officially open and unsolved. The disappearance had lasting consequences beyond the personal tragedy. The investigation revealed serious deficiencies in Vermont's law enforcement coordination. There was no state police force at the time, just local sheriffs and town constables operating independently with limited resources and no mechanism for coordinating complex investigations. Paula's case directly led to the formation of the Vermont State Police in 1947, created specifically to handle investigations that crossed jurisdictional boundaries or required resources beyond what local departments could provide. The psychological impact on the Bennington community was profound. People became reluctant to hike alone on the mountain. Parents kept closer watch on their children. The idea that someone could vanish so completely in broad daylight, seen by multiple witnesses right up until the moment they disappeared, challenged people's basic assumptions about how the world worked. And something else happened. People began looking back and noticing that Paula Welden was not the first person to disappear around Glastenbury Mountain. Middie Rivers had vanished the previous year under similarly inexplicable circumstances. If two people could vanish within a year of each other in roughly the same area, was that coincidence or pattern? They would not have to wait long to find out. The impossible. Vanishing. James E. Tedford. 3 years to the day after Paula Welden disappeared, on December 1, 1949, the Bennington Triangle claimed another victim in circumstances that defy rational explanation. If Rivers and Welden had simply walked into the wilderness and gotten lost, what happened to James Tedford cannot be explained so easily. Because James Tedford disappeared from a moving bus, surrounded by witnesses, with all his belongings left behind as if he had simply evaporated from his seat. James Tedford was 68 years old, a veteran of World War I who lived at the Vermont Soldiers' Home in Bennington. The facility provided housing and care for military veterans, and Tedford had been a resident there for some time. In late November 1949, he traveled north to St. Albans, Vermont, to visit relatives who still lived in the area. On December 1st, those relatives accompanied Tedford to the local bus station in St. Albans and watched him board the southbound bus that would take him back to Bennington. The bus departed St. Albans with 14 passengers on board, including Tedford. Multiple witnesses, including the bus driver, confirmed his presence. He took a seat, stored his luggage in the overhead rack, and settled in for the journey. The bus made its way south along Route 7, a highway that runs through Vermont's Champlain Valley before turning toward Bennington. At Burlington, the bus stopped, and Tedford encountered an old friend. The two spoke for several minutes on the platform before Tedford reboarded. Witnesses confirmed he was on the bus when it left Burlington. At the last scheduled stop before Bennington, 14 passengers were on the bus. Multiple people later confirmed they had seen Tedford sitting in his seat. Some witnesses reported he appeared to be sleeping. Others remembered seeing him awake but quiet, looking out the window as the bus traveled through the increasingly mountainous terrain, approaching Bennington. The bus continued toward Bennington, passing through the area near Glastenbury Mountain. Then it pulled into the Bennington terminal. When passengers began disembarking, James Tedford was not among them. The driver did a count and came up one person short. He walked back through the bus, checking the seats and the bathroom. Tedford was nowhere to be found, but his belongings were still in the overhead luggage rack exactly where he had placed them. On his empty seat lay an open bus timetable that he had been reading. His coat was still draped over the seat. Everything Tedford had brought with him was still there. The man himself had vanished. The driver questioned the other passengers. No one had seen Tedford get off the bus at any point after Burlington. No one had noticed him moving toward the door. No one had heard or seen anything unusual. One moment he was there, sitting quietly in his seat. The next moment, he was not. Police investigated thoroughly. They contacted the bus driver, who later reported seeing a man resembling Tedford possibly getting off in the village of Brandon, about 70 miles north of Bennington, though this could not be confirmed. That same night, Brandon police investigated a report of a man fitting Tedford's description, acting queerly in the village's downtown, but they were unable to locate him. The investigation was complicated by a delay in reporting. Tedford's disappearance went unreported for an entire week until December 8th, when the superintendent of the Bennington Soldiers' Home notified police that Tedford had never arrived. This gap between his disappearance and the official report meant that any immediate search efforts were impossible, and witnesses' memories had already begun to fade. Newspaper reports at the time indicated that Tedford suffered from mental illness, and that his family stated he had been despondent about returning to Bennington, preferring to stay with his relatives in St. Albans. This information led some investigators to theorize that Tedford might have gotten off the bus somewhere between Burlington and Bennington in a confused or upset state, though no driver or passenger reported seeing this happen. The bus route passed through areas where a confused person might have wandered off into woods or fields, particularly if it had been dark or if weather conditions made visibility poor. It was theoretically possible that Tedford had slipped off the bus at a stop where most passengers remained seated, walking away before anyone noticed his absence. But this theory has significant problems. First, witnesses insisted they had seen Tedford on the bus at the last stop before Bennington, not at some earlier point where he might have departed unnoticed. Second, even if Tedford had managed to leave the bus without being seen, that does not explain why he left all his belongings behind, including his coat. December in Vermont is bitterly cold. Based on what we know about human behavior in cold weather, leaving behind one's only warm clothing would be unusual unless the person was in a state of significant confusion or distress. The timing of Tedford's disappearance, exactly 3 years to the day after Paula Welden vanished, struck local residents as deeply unsettling. Some have suggested this date connection might indicate a pattern, though skeptics note that focusing on matching dates could be a form of pattern recognition where none exists. What remains documented is the fact that both disappeared on December 1st, and this coincidence, whether meaningful or not, contributed to growing fears in the community. James Tedford was never seen again. Despite investigations and searches of the areas around the bus route, no trace of him was ever found. His case remains unsolved. A man who apparently vanished from a moving vehicle in the presence of more than a dozen witnesses, without anyone noticing the moment of his disappearance. The youngest victim, Paul Jepson. On October 12, 1950, Columbus Day, the Bennington Triangle claimed its youngest and perhaps most heartbreaking victim. 8-year-old Paul Jepson vanished in circumstances that would lead some to suspect abduction, but the complete absence of evidence would align his case with the previous disappearances in ways that defied easy explanation. Paul Jepson was born on March 15, 1942. He lived with his parents in North Bennington, where they ran a farm and took care of the pigs at the town dump as part of their caretaking responsibilities. Paul had been born with a disability that prevented him from attending regular school, so he spent most days with his mother as she went about her farm work. October 12th was a Thursday, and with no school because of the Columbus Day holiday, Paul accompanied his mother to the Bennington Town Dump on East Road, where the family kept their herd of pigs. They arrived around 3 p.m. Paul's mother knew feeding the pigs would not take very long, maybe half an hour at most. Paul asked if he could wait in the family's pickup truck rather than walking around the dump, and his mother agreed. She left him sitting in the cab and went to tend to the animals. Paul was wearing a bright red jacket, similar to the one Paula Welden had been wearing when she disappeared. This detail would later seem potentially significant to investigators looking for connections between the cases. Whether this represented an actual pattern or simply coincidence remained unclear, as red is a common color for outdoor clothing, particularly during Vermont's hunting season when visibility is important for safety. When Paul's mother returned to the truck around 4 p.m., her son was gone. She called out for him, looked around the immediate area of the truck, and when she could not find him, raised the alarm. Within minutes, dozens of volunteers assembled to search the dump and surrounding area. Police were notified immediately, and the relatively new Vermont State Police, formed partly in response to the Paula Welden case, made all available resources available for the search. Bloodhounds were brought in to track Paul's scent. The dogs picked up a trail leading away from the truck toward the nearby East Road. The trail was strong at first, suggesting Paul had walked in that direction deliberately. The dogs followed the scent to a crossroads where Route 7 intersected with smaller local roads. Then, the trail simply ended. In the middle of the road, with no obvious explanation, Paul's scent vanished. The abrupt ending of the scent trail suggested several possibilities to investigators. Heavy rain could wash away a scent trail, but weather records indicate October 12th was clear and dry. The scent trail ending at a road intersection strongly suggested that Paul had been picked up by a vehicle. Perhaps a passing motorist, seeing a young boy alone, had stopped to offer help, or, more sinisterly, to abduct him. Paul's father told investigators that his son had been obsessed with Glastenbury Mountain in the days before his disappearance, talking constantly about wanting to visit the mountains. This statement led some to theorize that Paul might have wandered toward the mountain on his own, driven by childish fascination. The Bloodhound Trail heading in the general direction of Glastenbury Mountain seemed to support this theory. But if Paul had been walking toward the mountain, why did his scent trail end at the road? And why did extensive searches of the area toward Glastenbury reveal no trace of the boy? He was wearing a bright red jacket that should have been visible from considerable distance, especially in the fall when many trees had already dropped their leaves. Over the following days, hundreds of volunteers combed through the area. The U.S. Coast Guard provided aircraft for aerial searches. The Vermont Aeronautics Commission contributed planes. Military helicopters joined the search. Ground teams checked abandoned buildings, wells, mine shafts, and ravines. They searched along streams where a child might have fallen and drowned. They examined thick brush where an injured boy might have crawled and been hidden. Despite all these efforts, no trace of Paul Jepson was ever found. No piece of his red jacket, no footprints beyond those the bloodhounds had followed to the crossroads, no body, nothing. The theory that Paul had been abducted by a passing motorist offered a rational explanation that did not require invoking supernatural forces or strange phenomena. Child abductions, while rare, do happen. A confused or injured child on a road might accept a ride from a stranger. A predator might seize an opportunity when seeing a vulnerable target, but the complete absence of evidence haunted the investigation. Even abduction cases typically produce some trace evidence. Witnesses who saw a suspicious vehicle, reports of a similar child seen elsewhere, eventually a body when the perpetrator disposes of it. Paul Jepson's case produced nothing except a scent trail that ended as if the earth had simply swallowed him. The fact that Paul's disappearance occurred so close to where Paula Welden had vanished 4 years earlier, and that both were wearing red jackets, struck investigators as potentially significant. Was there a pattern? Did someone with a fixation on people wearing red clothing operate in the area? Or was this simply coincidence, red being a common color for outdoor clothing, especially in hunting season when bright colors help prevent accidents? Paul's father held on to hope for years that his son might have been taken by someone and was still alive somewhere. But as time passed without any credible sightings or evidence, that hope faded. Paul Jepson joined the growing list of people who had walked into or near the Glastenbury wilderness and simply ceased to exist. The only body, Frieda Langer. 16 days after Paul Jepson disappeared, the Bennington Triangle claimed what would be its final confirmed victim, and this case would prove the most enigmatic of all because it is the only one where a body was eventually found. The discovery of Frieda Langer's remains would answer some questions while creating new mysteries that persist to this day. Frieda Langer was 53 years old, an experienced hiker and outdoorswoman thoroughly familiar with the Glastenbury area. She lived in North Adams, Massachusetts, with her husband Max, and the couple owned a family cabin on the shores of Somerset Reservoir. Frieda was not some inexperienced city dweller wandering into unfamiliar territory. She was skilled at wilderness survival, knew the trails and terrain, and had hiked these mountains many times before. On October 28, 1950, Frieda and her husband Max drove up from North Adams to their cabin, accompanied by Frieda's cousin, Herbert Elsner. Max was recovering from a knee injury and planned to rest at the cabin while Frieda and Herbert went for a hike. The day was pleasant, and the hike was intended to be a short, easy one, staying on familiar trails relatively close to the cabin. Around 1 p.m., Frieda and Herbert set out. They were only a few hundred yards from the cabin when Frieda slipped while crossing a stream and fell into the cold water, soaking her clothes and shoes completely. Given how close they still were to the cabin, Frieda suggested to Herbert that he wait there while she ran back to change into dry clothing. She would only be gone a few minutes. Then they could continue their hike in comfort. Herbert agreed and settled in to wait. He was not concerned. The cabin was visible from where he stood. The weather was good. His cousin was an experienced hiker who had navigated these woods countless times. She would change clothes and return shortly. But Frieda Langer never came back. After waiting for some time with increasing concern, Herbert returned to the cabin himself to check on Frieda. He found Max resting as expected, but Frieda had not returned. She had never made it back to the cabin. Somewhere in the short distance between where Herbert waited and the cabin entrance, Frieda had vanished. The search that followed was the most intensive yet. Coming so soon after Paul Jepson's disappearance, authorities and the public were primed for immediate action. Over the next 2 weeks, 5 separate organized searches were conducted. At various times, up to 300 searchers participated, including police, volunteers, firefighters, and soldiers. Aircraft surveyed the area from above. Helicopters from the Connecticut Coast Guard and U.S. Army bases in Massachusetts joined the search. The Massachusetts National Guard contributed personnel. The Vermont Aeronautics Commission provided additional aircraft support. Search teams worked in carefully coordinated patterns, examining every square foot of terrain. They knew approximately where Frieda had been when she fell into the stream. They knew where the cabin was located. The distance between these 2 points was minimal. Whatever had happened to Frieda had happened. In a very confined area that should have been easily searchable, they found nothing. No footprints beyond those they had already identified. No pieces of wet clothing that she might have discarded. No sign of injury or struggle. No indication that she had ever walked back toward the cabin or in any other direction. Frieda's husband Max suggested a possible explanation to investigators. Frieda suffered from a seizure disorder. He theorized that exposure to the cold water from her fall might have triggered a seizure, causing her to become disoriented and lost. This would explain why she never made it back to the cabin. She might have wandered in the wrong direction, become confused, and collapsed somewhere in the woods. This theory made medical sense, but it did not explain why searchers could not find her. A person suffering a seizure might wander, but they would leave tracks. They would disturb vegetation. They would eventually collapse, and their body would be visible from aircraft or found by ground teams systematically covering the area. After 2 weeks of intensive searching produced no results, the search was reluctantly called off. The Langer family held on to hope that somehow Frieda had survived and would be found, but as winter approached and snow began to fall, that hope dimmed. Then, on May 12, 1951, 7 months after Frieda's disappearance, fishermen discovered her body. The location was near Somerset Reservoir, about 3.5 miles from the campsite where she had disappeared. The body was found on the shore of the eastern branch of the Deerfield River, in an open area that multiple search teams had previously examined. The discovery raised immediate questions. This area had been searched. Aircraft had flown over it. Ground teams had walked through it. How had they missed a body? The available evidence suggests several possible explanations. Frieda might have somehow still been alive during the initial searches, wandering further from the cabin than anyone suspected, only dying later and being deposited in this location by spring flooding. Alternatively, the searchers might have simply missed her body in an area that appeared to have been thoroughly covered, an outcome that, while troubling, sometimes occurs even in well-organized searches. The condition of the body made determining cause of death impossible. After 7 months exposed to Vermont's harsh winter, the remains had decomposed so badly that forensic examination could determine almost nothing. Investigators theorized that Frieda might have fallen down an embankment into a deep pond, drowned, and then been flushed out months later by spring runoff from melting snow. This would explain why she had not been found initially, and why her body appeared in an area that had been previously searched. However, accepting this explanation requires accepting several scenarios that, while possible, seem unlikely when considered together. First, that an experienced outdoorswoman had somehow gotten completely turned around in familiar territory only a few hundred yards from her cabin. Second, that she had fallen into water deep enough to drown her in an area where searchers found no such body of water. Third, that her body had remained hidden for 7 months before being conveniently deposited in an open area just as the snow melted. Some investigators and local residents suggested a darker possibility. Perhaps Frieda had been abducted and killed. The perpetrator, knowing that intensive searches were ongoing, kept her body hidden until the searches ended and public attention moved elsewhere. Then, months later, when it seemed safe, the killer returned the body to an area that had already been searched, knowing that the decomposition would hide evidence of foul play. This theory would explain why the body appeared in a previously searched area and why the decomposition was so extensive. But it required accepting that someone had been operating in the area with enough local knowledge to evade search teams, enough planning to hide a body for months, and enough boldness to return it to a location where it would eventually be found. While not impossible, this scenario involves assumptions that go beyond what the evidence can definitively support. Neither explanation fully satisfies. Either we accept that multiple search teams somehow missed a body in an open area, or we accept that someone deliberately hid the body and returned it later. Both scenarios strain credibility. The discovery of Frieda Langer's body was both a conclusion and a deepening of the mystery. Her family finally had closure of a sort, though the lack of a determinable cause of death meant they would never know for certain what had happened in those minutes after she left Herbert waiting by the stream. For investigators and the public, the case demonstrated that at least some of the Bennington Triangle's victims could be found, but the circumstances of Frieda's disappearance and the discovery of her remains created as many questions as they answered. Frieda Langer was the last of the 5 core disappearances. After October 1950, no more unexplained vanishings occurred in the immediate Glastenbury area, at least none that achieved the notoriety of these cases. The active phase of the Bennington Triangle phenomenon, if phenomenon it was, appeared to have ended as suddenly and mysteriously as it had begun. Additional cases and the expanding legend. While Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frieda Langer form the core 5 disappearances of the Bennington Triangle. Other cases from earlier and later periods have occasionally been linked to the phenomenon, expanding the legend and complicating efforts to understand what, if anything, connects these events. In 1943, 2 years before Rivers disappeared, Carl Herrick went missing while hunting with his cousin Henry about 10 miles northeast of Glastenbury Mountain. After the two men became separated, Henry alerted authorities. Searchers found Herrick's body after several days. His gun lay nearby with no bullets discharged, suggesting he had not fired at anything before his death. The autopsy determined a bizarre cause of death: squeezing. Herrick's ribs had been forced inward with such pressure that they punctured his lungs. The finding raised disturbing questions. What could have squeezed a grown man hard enough to break his ribs and puncture his lungs? A bear attack might produce such injuries, but bears typically leave other evidence: claw marks, bite wounds, signs of struggle. Herrick's body showed only the crushing injury to his chest. Had he been caught in some kind of trap or fallen in a way that compressed his rib cage? Or had something else, something with immense strength, grabbed him and squeezed until he could no longer breathe? Some researchers include Herrick's death as the first victim of the Bennington Triangle, though others note that his body was found and a cause of death was determined, making his case fundamentally different from the disappearances that followed. Still, the bizarre nature of his death and the proximity to Glastenbury Mountain have kept his case connected to the larger mystery. In November 1950, shortly after Frieda Langer's disappearance, 16-year-old Martha Jeanette Jones was reported missing. Jones had been hitchhiking to a seminary school in Manchester, Vermont. For an entire month, her absence went unnoticed because her school assumed she was home with family, while her family assumed she was at school. When the miscommunication was finally discovered and her disappearance reported, any trail had long gone cold. No witnesses came forward. No one had seen her after she began hitchhiking. Martha Jones was never found. Some accounts link Jones's case to the Bennington Triangle, noting the temporal proximity to the other disappearances and the similar lack of evidence. However, others argue that a hitchhiking teenager who vanished somewhere along a highway represents a different type of case, more consistent with abduction by a motorist than with the strange pattern of people vanishing in or near wilderness areas. Around the same time, some sources mention a woman named Frances Chrisman, who supposedly disappeared on December 3, 1950, while walking to visit a friend who lived half a mile away. Details of this case are sparse and difficult to verify, with sources providing conflicting information about dates and circumstances. It is possible that Chrisman represents a separate disappearance that has been connected to the Bennington Triangle legend through repeated retelling, or it might be a case of historical records becoming confused with other events. Beyond these potential victims, the Glastenbury area has a documented history of unexplained deaths and disappearances extending back into the 19th century. In 1892, Henry McDowell, a worker at a local sawmill, killed his co-worker John Crowley in a brutal attack, later claiming he heard voices telling him to do it. McDowell was sentenced to life in an asylum, but escaped during transport. He was reportedly spotted near Glastenbury Mountain, but vanished before police could recapture him. He was never found. The question of how many people have actually disappeared in the Bennington Triangle depends on how broadly you define the geographic area and time period. Some sources claim as many as 30 to 40 people have vanished in the region over the past century and a half. Others maintain that only the core 5 cases from 1945 to 1950 represent genuinely mysterious disappearances, with other cases being either solvable by conventional means or lacking sufficient documentation to draw firm conclusions. What is clear is that even if we accept only the 5 core cases as legitimate mysteries, that concentration of disappearances in a 5-year period represents a statistical anomaly. Small rural areas simply do not typically lose 5 people to unexplained vanishings in such a short time span. Something unusual happened in the Glastenbury area between 1945 and 1950. Whether that something was a series of tragic coincidences, human predation, or something stranger still. Theories and explanations. Making sense of the vanishings. Over the decades since the disappearances, investigators, researchers, and armchair detectives have proposed numerous theories attempting to explain what happened in the Bennington Triangle. These theories range from mundane to supernatural, from carefully researched to wildly speculative. None of them fully accounts for all the evidence, or rather, for the complete absence of evidence that characterizes these cases. The serial killer theory. The most commonly proposed rational explanation is that a serial killer operated in the Bennington area during the 1945 and 1950 period, systematically abducting and murdering victims. This theory has the advantage of not requiring any supernatural elements while explaining why multiple people vanished in a concentrated geographic area during a defined time period. Supporting this theory are the facts that the victims varied in age and gender, but all disappeared from roughly the same area, and the vanishings stopped suddenly after 1950, possibly because the perpetrator died, moved away, or was incarcerated for other crimes. The theory also accounts for why bodies were generally not found. A methodical killer might have hidden remains in locations that searchers overlooked. However, the serial killer theory faces significant problems. First, serial killers typically target victims who fit a specific profile based on age, gender, or other characteristics. The Bennington victims ranged from an 8-year-old boy to a 74-year-old man, including both males and females. This diversity suggests the cases may not be connected in the way serial killer patterns typically manifest. Second, serial killers generally follow patterns in how they acquire victims. Some abduct people from specific locations. Others use a particular method of approach. The Bennington victims include a hunter leading a group, a college student seen by multiple witnesses on a popular trail, a man who vanished from a moving bus, a child taken from beside his mother's truck, and an experienced hiker who disappeared between 2 points only a few hundred yards apart. The variety of circumstances could imply that if these cases are connected, the perpetrator would have needed to operate with unusual flexibility and opportunism. Third, the complete absence of physical evidence is striking. Serial killers may be careful, but they rarely leave absolutely no trace. Bodies are eventually found. Crime scenes yield evidence. Witnesses report suspicious vehicles or individuals. The Bennington cases produce none of this. Even the eventual discovery of Frieda Langer's body revealed no evidence of foul play, though the decomposition made determination difficult. The natural causes theory. Some researchers argue that the disappearances can be explained by ordinary hazards of wilderness hiking combined with the particularly challenging terrain of the Glastenbury area. According to this theory, each victim met their end through some natural accident, falling into an abandoned mine shaft, tumbling into a hidden ravine, becoming disoriented and dying of exposure, or drowning in deep water. The theory points to Vermont's harsh terrain and weather. Glastenbury Mountain is riddled with hazards from its industrial past: abandoned mines, wells, logging equipment, and structures slowly being reclaimed by forest. The area's geology includes natural sinkholes and limestone formations that could potentially collapse or trap unwary hikers. Weather patterns can change rapidly in the mountains, with fog rolling in suddenly and completely disorienting even experienced woodsmen. Proponents of natural causes note that wilderness areas regularly claim lives in completely mundane ways, and sometimes bodies are never found because they end up in locations that searchers never think to check, or because animals scatter the remains. The concentration of disappearances in a 5-year period could be statistical clustering rather than indication of a pattern. However, this theory struggles to explain several key facts. If the victims died of natural causes in the wilderness, why did massive searches involving hundreds of people fail to find any trace of them? Modern search and rescue operations, even in the 1940s and 1950s, were generally successful at locating people who died of exposure or injury in the woods. The searches for the Bennington victims were extensive, thorough, and conducted by people intimately familiar with the terrain. The natural causes theory also does not explain James Tedford's disappearance from a bus or Paul Jepson's vanishing from beside his mother's truck at a dump. These locations are not wilderness areas where someone could easily wander off and become lost. While natural accidents might explain some of the cases, applying this theory consistently to all five requires accepting an implausible series of coincidences. The wildlife attack theory. Vermont's forests are home to dangerous wildlife, particularly black bears. Some researchers have suggested that animal attacks, particularly by bears or possibly by a mountain lion, might explain some of the disappearances. Bears can be aggressive if surprised, or if they feel their cubs are threatened. A person killed by a bear might be dragged away from the attack site, and bears will sometimes partially bury or hide their kills. This theory faces immediate obstacles. Bear attacks leave extensive evidence: blood, torn clothing, disturbed ground, and often scattered remains that scavengers eventually spread across a wide area. None of the Bennington searches found any such evidence. Moreover, black bears in Vermont rarely attack adult humans, and attacks resulting in death are extraordinarily rare. An attack on a child like Paul Jepson would be somewhat more plausible, but the fact that he vanished from a populated area rather than deep wilderness makes even this scenario unlikely. Mountain lions have been proposed as another possibility. Cougars were historically present in Vermont and are skilled at dragging prey away from attack sites. However, mountain lions were largely extinct in Vermont by the 1940s, with no confirmed sightings for years. While occasional transient mountain lions from Canadian populations might pass through Vermont, the idea that one was present in the Glastenbury area and systematically attacking people strains credibility. The wildlife attack theory completely fails to explain James Tedford's disappearance from a bus, or how an animal could have taken Frieda Langer from a trail only a few hundred yards from her cabin without leaving any trace. The disorientation and hypothermia theory. A more sophisticated version of the natural causes theory focuses specifically on how quickly hikers can become disoriented in mountainous terrain and how rapidly hypothermia can set in under the right conditions. This theory notes that Glastenbury Mountain has documented unusual wind patterns that can disorient travelers. The Abenaki called it the place where the four winds meet because crosswinds converge at elevation, creating unstable and confusing conditions. According to this theory, even experienced woodsmen like Middie Rivers could become turned around when familiar landmarks disappear in sudden fog, or when exhaustion and slight dehydration begin affecting judgment. Once disoriented, a person might walk in circles, moving further from rescue with each step. In cold weather, hypothermia can set in quickly, especially if someone has gotten wet. Hypothermia creates its own confusion and disorientation, leading victims to make irrational decisions like removing clothing or hiding in small spaces. The theory has some explanatory power, particularly for cases like Frieda Langer, who fell into cold water. Wet clothing dramatically increases heat loss, and if she suffered a seizure as her husband suggested, the combination of cold, confusion, and medical crisis could have been fatal. Her body eventually being found suggests she died somewhere in the area and was later discovered, supporting the idea that her death had natural causes even if the initial searches missed her. However, this theory still struggles with the scale of the searches. multiple organized search efforts involving aircraft, ground teams, and systematic coverage of terrain should find people who died of hypothermia or exposure, even if they wandered some distance from where they were last seen. The complete absence of evidence in most of the cases remains unexplained. The supernatural and paranormal theories. When conventional explanations fail to satisfy, people naturally turn to unconventional ones. The Bennington Triangle has accumulated a rich collection of supernatural theories over the decades, many building on the area's pre-existing reputation for strangeness. The Abenaki legend of the man-eating rock has been cited by some as a literal explanation. According to this theory, there exists somewhere in the Glastenbury wilderness an anomalous stone formation with properties that science cannot explain, something that can trap or consume people who step on it. This theory has the advantage of accounting for the complete disappearance of victims without trace, but it requires believing in the existence of something that has no basis in physics or geology. UFO and alien abduction theories have also been applied to the Bennington Triangle, noting that the area has a history of reported UFO sightings and unexplained lights in the sky. According to this theory, the victims were taken by extraterrestrial beings conducting some kind of study or experiment. While this would explain the complete absence of bodies and evidence, it requires accepting a framework of reality for which there is no credible scientific evidence. Interdimensional portals or vortexes represent another category of supernatural explanation. These theories propose that certain locations, including Glastenbury Mountain, represent weak points in reality where people can slip from our dimension into another, either permanently or temporarily. The concentration of disappearances in a 5-year period might represent a time when such a portal was particularly active before closing or shifting elsewhere. The Bennington Monster and Bigfoot-related theories propose that a large, undiscovered primate species inhabits the deep forests of Vermont and occasionally attacks or abducts humans. Sightings of large, hairy, bipedal creatures have been reported in the Glastenbury area for more than 2 centuries, with the most recent confirmed sightings occurring in 2003, when multiple witnesses reported seeing a tall, dark figure moving through the woods near Glastenbury Mountain. While Bigfoot theories have entertainment value and build on legitimate eyewitness accounts of strange creatures, they face the same evidentiary problems as all cryptozoological theories. No bodies, no bones, no clear photographs, no physical evidence of any kind has emerged to confirm the existence of such creatures. Moreover, even if we accept that unknown primates exist in Vermont forests, there is no reason to believe they would systematically target and kill humans while leaving no trace. A final category of supernatural theory invokes curses, either the Abenaki curse mentioned in folklore or some other malevolent force attached to the mountain itself. According to these theories, Glastenbury Mountain is fundamentally wrong, a place where natural laws operate differently, where the boundary between the living world and something else becomes dangerously thin. People who venture into this cursed area risk being claimed by whatever dark force resides there. Curse theories have the advantage of not requiring any specific mechanism. The curse simply is, operating by rules we cannot understand. But this same quality makes curse theories unfalsifiable and ultimately unsatisfying as explanations. They name the mystery rather than solving it. The mundane combination. Theory. Perhaps the most intellectually honest approach acknowledges that there may not be a single explanation for all the disappearances. Each case might have its own prosaic explanation, and the appearance of a pattern might be primarily an artifact of how we group and interpret events after the fact. Under this theory, Middie Rivers suffered some kind of sudden medical event, collapsed in a location searchers did not check, and his body was subsequently hidden by animals or natural processes. Paula Welden might have been picked up by someone after her walk, possibly someone she knew, and met with foul play in a completely different location. James Tedford might have slipped off the bus during a stop, perhaps in a confused state related to his mental health issues, and wandered into the woods to die of exposure. Paul Jepson was likely abducted by a passing motorist. Frieda Langer died in an accident, and her body was simply missed during initial searches before being discovered months later. This theory requires no serial killers, no supernatural forces, no unusual phenomena. Just a series of unrelated tragedies that happened to occur in the same general area over a 5-year period. Statistical clustering suggests that random events sometimes bunch together in ways that appear meaningful, but actually represent nothing more than the natural variation we should expect in any large data set. The problem with this theory is that it feels unsatisfying, a kind of intellectual cop-out that explains everything by explaining nothing. It also requires us to accept that several highly unusual events, each with its own improbable characteristics, all happened to occur in the same small area during the same narrow time window entirely by coincidence. The legend lives on today, more than 70 years after the last confirmed disappearance. The Bennington Triangle remains a subject of fascination, investigation, and debate. The mystery has been featured in numerous books, television programs, podcasts, and online investigations. It has inspired fiction and folklore, become part of Vermont's cultural identity, and drawn curious visitors to the region who want to walk the same trails where Paula Welden was last seen, or stand on the mountain where 5 lives ended without explanation. The physical landscape has changed since the 1940s and 1950s. Glastenbury and Somerset remain unincorporated ghost towns, but they are no longer quite as isolated as they once were. The Long Trail continues to attract hikers from around the world, though most who walk it today have never heard of Paula Welden. The Green Mountain National Forest manages the wilderness areas, maintaining trails and providing recreation opportunities for the public. Modern visitors to the area report mixed experiences. Some find Glastenbury Mountain peaceful and beautiful, no different from any other wilderness area in New England. They hike the trails, enjoy the views, and leave with nothing more unusual than a sense of accomplishment at completing a challenging climb. The fire tower at the summit, though currently closed for repairs, has provided generations of hikers with spectacular views across the Green Mountains. Others report feeling uncomfortable in the deep woods around Glastenbury. They describe an unusual silence, as if the normal forest sounds of birds and small animals are muted or absent. They mention sudden fog that rolls in without warning, disorienting even experienced hikers. They talk about feeling watched, about an instinctive urge to leave the area quickly. Whether these sensations reflect genuine anomalies or simply the psychological weight of knowing the area's history remains unclear. The town of Glastenbury itself, such as it still exists, has made its peace with the legend. According to the 2020 census, only 9 people live in the entire township, making it one of the least populated municipalities in Vermont. These residents value their isolation and independence, and while they are aware of the Bennington Triangle stories, most view them as folklore rather than active danger. Local authorities maintain that Glastenbury Mountain is no more dangerous than any other wilderness area if proper precautions are taken. Hikers should stay on marked trails, carry appropriate gear, inform others of their plans, and be prepared for rapidly changing weather conditions. The same advice applies to any mountain hiking in New England. The disappearances of the 1940s and 1950s, they argue, represent a historical anomaly, not an ongoing threat. Joseph Citro, who coined the term Bennington Triangle and has spent decades researching Vermont's mysteries, offers a measured perspective. He acknowledges that the area has a long history of strange reports and unexplained events, but he is careful not to make claims he cannot support with evidence. In interviews, Citro has emphasized that the wilderness around Glastenbury Mountain offers many prosaic ways for people to vanish: abandoned wells, steep ravines, sudden weather changes, and the sheer vastness of the forest. The fact that disappeared persons are not found does not necessarily mean something supernatural occurred. Sometimes, he suggests, the forest simply keeps its secrets. Other researchers are less restrained. Books and websites dedicated to the Bennington Triangle often present the disappearances as definitive proof of paranormal activity, part of a larger pattern of supernatural phenomena that includes UFO sightings, Bigfoot encounters, and various other mysteries. These interpretations tend to focus on the most dramatic elements of each case while downplaying or ignoring details that suggest more mundane explanations. The truth, if it can be called that, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The disappearances happened. The searches failed. People vanished without trace in circumstances that strain conventional explanation. These are documented historical facts, attested to by police reports, newspaper accounts, and the testimony of numerous witnesses. Something unusual occurred in the Bennington area between 1945 and 1950, even if that something was only an unlikely clustering of unrelated tragedies. The unanswered questions. More than 7 decades after the last disappearance, the Bennington Triangle continues to pose questions we cannot confidently answer. Why did 5 people vanish from roughly the same area in such a short time period? Is this pattern meaningful or merely coincidence? Statistical analysis could potentially determine whether 5 disappearances in 5 years represents a genuine anomaly or falls within the range of normal variation for rural wilderness areas, but no rigorous analysis of this kind has been conducted and published. Why were the searches so uniformly unsuccessful? Even allowing for the challenges of the terrain, modern search and rescue operations have demonstrated remarkable success at locating missing persons in wilderness areas. The Bennington searches involved experienced woodsmen, military personnel, aircraft, and dogs. They covered the ground systematically, often going over the same areas multiple times. Yet they found almost nothing. Was the terrain truly that difficult? Or did something else prevent the searches from succeeding? What happened to James Tedford? Of all the cases, his disappearance is perhaps the most difficult to explain through conventional means. How does a person vanish from a moving bus surrounded by witnesses? The most rational explanation requires that either Tedford got off at a stop without being noticed, and his absence was only discovered later, or the witnesses were mistaken about having seen him at the last stop before Bennington. But both possibilities require multiple people to have been wrong about what they saw, and the physical evidence of his belongings remaining on the bus suggests he did not simply get off normally. Why was Frieda Langer's body found in an area that had been previously searched? Either the search teams missed a body lying in an open area, which seems unlikely given the scale and thoroughness of the search, or her body was not there during the initial searches and appeared later. If it appeared later, how? Spring flooding offers one explanation, but the scenario requires very specific conditions to work. Was there another explanation that investigators missed? Why did the disappearances stop? If a serial killer was responsible, why did they stop taking victims after 1950? If environmental factors were to blame, why did those factors apparently resolve themselves? If supernatural forces were involved, why did they become dormant? The sudden cessation of disappearances is as puzzling as their occurrence. What role, if any, did the red clothing worn by Paula Welden and Paul Jepson play in their disappearances? Was this detail significant or purely coincidental? Red is a common color for outdoor clothing, particularly during hunting season when visibility is important for safety. But the matching detail has fueled speculation about a potential killer with a specific preference or about some other pattern that investigators missed. lessons, and legacy. The Bennington Triangle serves as a reminder of how much remains unexplained in the world, even in an age of GPS satellites, cell phones, and advanced forensic science. The disappearances occurred before modern technology could be brought to bear on the mystery, and now, more than 70 years later, the trail has gone completely cold. Whatever evidence might have existed has long since been destroyed by time and weather. The cases also illustrate the limits of our ability to find people who vanish in wilderness areas. Despite Hollywood portrayals of search and rescue operations that always succeed, the reality is that dense forests can hide secrets effectively. Bodies are sometimes never found. Questions remain unanswered. Families never receive closure. For the families of the disappeared, the lack of resolution has meant decades of grief without the finality that knowledge, even terrible knowledge, can provide. Paula Welden's father spent years pursuing leads and hoping for his daughter's return. Paul Jepson's parents never knew what happened to their son. These personal tragedies extend beyond the individuals who vanished to encompass the loved ones they left behind. The formation of the Vermont State Police stands as the most concrete legacy of the disappearances. Paula Welden's case directly led to the creation of a statewide law enforcement agency capable of coordinating complex investigations and bringing resources to bear that local sheriff's departments could not match. In this sense, the tragedy produced at least one positive outcome, potentially preventing future cases from suffering the same investigative limitations. The Bennington Triangle has also become part of Vermont's folklore and cultural identity. Like the Bermuda Triangle, the Michigan Triangle, or London's Highgate Cemetery, it represents a place where the normal rules seem not to apply, where mystery persists despite our best efforts to dispel it. This quality makes it attractive to those who believe the world contains more than can be explained by science, and frustrating to skeptics who see only coincidence and the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. For researchers and investigators, the Bennington Triangle represents both a challenge and a cautionary tale. The challenge is to approach the cases with rigor, examining evidence without prejudice, and being willing to accept prosaic explanations when they fit the facts. The caution is against too quickly dismissing cases as solved when significant questions remain unanswered. The truth likely lies somewhere between supernatural speculation and overly confident rationalization. Conclusion: 5 people walked into or near the wilderness around Glastenbury Mountain between 1945 and 1950. An experienced hunter and guide, a college student on an afternoon hike, a veteran riding a bus home, an 8-year-old boy waiting for his mother, a skilled outdoorswoman changing her clothes. None of them came back. Despite massive searches, despite the involvement of law enforcement at every level, despite the attention of the national media, they simply vanished. We are left with questions. Too many questions. Why these people? Why this place? Why this time? What happened in the minutes or hours after they were last seen? Where are their remains? What did they experience in their final moments? The prosaic explanations feel insufficient. Yes, people get lost in the woods. Yes, accidents happen. Yes, predators both human and animal exist. But the combination of factors, the complete absence of evidence, the tight clustering in time and space, all of these elements create a pattern that feels meaningful, even if we cannot articulate exactly what that meaning might be. The supernatural explanations feel unsatisfying in a different way. They name the mystery rather than solving it. Saying something strange happened is not really an explanation at all, just an acknowledgement that we do not understand. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is simply this: we do not know what happened to the 5 people who disappeared in the Bennington Triangle. We may never know. The evidence is gone. The witnesses are nearly all dead. The landscape has changed. The mystery persists because mysteries sometimes do persist, because reality does not always cooperate with our desire for answers. The Bennington Triangle stands as a reminder that the world remains capable of surprise, that unexplained events do occur, and that even in the modern era, with all our technology and knowledge, there are questions we cannot answer and secrets we cannot uncover. 5 people walked into the woods and became legend. Their families never found peace. Their fates remain unknown. Somewhere in the mountains of Vermont, in the forests around Glastenbury, those 5 people ended their journeys. Whether they rest in unknown graves, whether their remains were scattered by animals and time, whether something stranger happened to them, we cannot say. But they are there, part of the mountain now, part of the mystery that will outlive all of us. This is the reality of the Bennington Triangle. Not monsters or curses or paranormal phenomena, but the simple, terrible fact of human beings disappearing without trace. The woods are quiet, the trails remain, and the mountain keeps its secrets. Thank you for listening to another episode of Lore to Mystery. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most puzzling unsolved mysteries, please subscribe to our channel for more long-form documentary content. We explore the forgotten tragedies, unexplained disappearances, and paranormal phenomena that haunt our history. Sweet dreams, and remember, not everyone who walks into the woods walks back out.